Mussolini was responding to what historians call the crisis of Marxism. Marx predicted that worker revolts would erupt in every industrialized country. But this never took place. Marx thought workers around the world would identify with each other on the basis of class. He rejected nationalism, saying a working man has no country. But Gentile, though himself a socialist, noticed that during World War I, working men fought for their own country. Mussolini and Gentile concluded that a new type of socialism was needed that would fuse nationalism and socialism. They called it fascism. And this is why socialists and progressives in America, many of whom had given up on orthodox Marxism, were drawn to fascism.
In the working out of a great national program that seeks the primary good of the greater number.
Our new president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was infatuated by Mussolini. He called him that admirable Italian gentleman. I am much interested and deeply impressed by what he has accomplished and by his evidenced honest purpose in restoring Italy. Mussolini reviewed FDR's book in an Italian magazine. His conclusion? FDR is one of us. He's a fascist. FDR dispatched members of his brain trust to Rome to study Italian fascism with a view to importing some of it here. Rexford Tugwell, one of FDR's closest advisors, after returning from Italy, observed, "Fascism is the cleanest, neatest, most efficient piece of social machinery I've ever seen. It makes me envious." The head of FDR's NRA, or National Recovery Act, Hugh Johnson, spoke of the shining example of Mussolini. He carried fascist literature in his pocket, and he called for the end of free market capitalism in America. He empowered industrial committees in every industry to set wages and prices and report to the federal government. Clearly, FDR recognized fascism was on the left. He saw it as more progressive than the New Deal. Mussolini was clearly a man of the left. But what about the ultimate fascist of them all, Adolf Hitler? Was he a man of the left? To figure this out, we must go to Europe. Hitler, like Mussolini, was a veteran of World War I. His politics were formed here in Schwabing in the atmosphere of bohemianism and sectarian socialism. The communist Lenin lived here in exile. Hitler and Lenin both frequented the same pub. Lenin famously didn't pay his bar tab. Imagine Lenin sitting here arguing with friends on how to save communism. Lenin lived just a block up the street. Hitler lived a block over. Hitler changed the name of the German Workers' Party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The very term Nazi is a compression of two words, National and Sozialista. Check out the official Nazi platform. State-controlled healthcare, profit sharing for workers and large corporations, moneylenders and profiteers punished by death, state control of education, state control of media and the press, state control of banks and industries, seizure of land without compensation, state control of religious expression. This reads like something jointly written by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Read the Nazi platform at the Democratic National Convention, and most likely it would provoke thunderous applause. Like Mussolini and Lenin, Hitler was anti-big business, anti-bourgeois, and anti-capitalist. But unlike Mussolini and Lenin, Hitler was also a racist. His racism, too, was rooted in his hatred of capitalism and business. He called the Jews greedy bankers. Hitler set out to destroy the Jews, confiscate their wealth, and redistribute it through Nazi, socialist, and welfare state programs.
Vereinigt euch! vom internationalen Klassenkampf.
Another group Hitler hated were the communists. Not because they were socialists, but because they took their orders from Moscow. His thuggery started right here at Schellingstrasse 50, Hitler's Nazi headquarters.
Ruhe! Wir müssen die Kommunisten 10-mal so stark zurückschlagen!
Hitler saw the communists as traitors to Germany.
Factors. That's what you got. Nach Kommunisten! Beerhogs, factories, universities! Deutsche Kriegspartei!
He was a national socialist, and they were international socialists. He patterned his brown shirts both on Mussolini's black shirts and on the Ku Klux Klan.
Eine einzige Kraft der ganzen Nation werden! Sie sind uns alle!
The Nazi brown shirts and the Klan were both about the same size, 2 to 3 million members. Both groups targeted a vulnerable minority. In the case of the brown shirts, Jews. In the case of the KKK, blacks. And both groups were extensions of a political party. In the case of the brown shirts, the Nazi Party. In the case of the Klan, the Democratic Party. In November of 1923, Hitler and his brown shirts took over the Burger Braukeller, a popular Munich beer hall.
Platz machen hier.
Entschuldigung.
Ja, das weiß ich auch. Verstehe ich nicht.
Die nationale Revolution ist ausgebrochen! Niemand darf den Raum verlassen! Entweder beginnt heute Nacht die deutsche Revolution, oder bin wir bei Morgendämmerung alle tot.
The following day, Hitler and 2,000 party members marched on Munich to seize control. They were met by police. Hitler was arrested and sent to Landsberg prison, a formative period in his life. Here, Hitler dictated Mein Kampf to his fellow prisoner, Rudolf Hess.
Der Nationalsozialismus ist der Entschluss, einen neuen Menschen zu erschaffen. Dort wird kein Wille mehr existieren, keine Königreiche, in denen das Individuum sich selbst gehören wird. Die Zeit des Glücks als private Angelegenheit ist vorbei.
See how remote all of this is from the principles of Abraham Lincoln and the American founding? Hitler, however, had a much greater affinity for progressives and Democrats.
Die eine Lüge sagen und oft genug wird man es glauben.
It was here Hitler got a big idea from the Democratic Party. one that would shape his murderous campaigns. According to Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer John Toland, Hitler often praised the extermination of the red savages who could not be tamed by captivity. Hitler admired how Jacksonian Democrats gunned down the millions of Redskins to a few 100,000 and now keep the modest remnant under observation in a cage. His idea was to do to the Poles, the Slavs, the Eastern Europeans, and the Russians precisely what the Jacksonian Democrats did to the Indians. Hitler came to power in 1933. On the other side of the Atlantic, another charismatic leader, FDR, was elected. The two men recognized each other as fellow progressives. Here's what the Nazi newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter, said of the FDR administration. We too, as German National Socialists, are looking toward America. The Nazi paper congratulated FDR for replacing the uninhibited frenzy of market speculation with the adoption of National Socialist strains of thought. Of FDR's New Deal, the Völkischer Beobachter said, "We fear only the possibility that it might fail." Hitler quickly consolidated his power. He executed leaders of the brown shirts who had challenged his authority. This was the famous Night of the Long Knives. Some progressives try to portray Hitler as a right-winger by insisting he was anti-gay. But Hitler knew that the brown shirt leader, Ernst Röhm, was a notorious homosexual, as were many other brown shirts. When Hitler showed up to arrest Röhm, he encountered a remarkable scene.
Allmannsdienst! Röhm, Sie sind verhaftet! Sie sind ein Verräter!
Röhm publicly suggested that he, not Hitler, was the true leader of the Nazi Party.
Hey, Jünge!
When Heinrich Himmler urged Hitler to purge the gay brown shirts out of the Nazi movement, Hitler refused. Hitler said he didn't care what the brown shirts did in private, as long as they were good fighters. Hitler was no social conservative. Earlier we saw what Hitler learned from the Democrats, but was there anything he learned from American progressives? Investigative journalist Edwin Black, the son of Holocaust survivors, is the author of The War Against the Weak.
Now, you have written that eugenics in America, and this is true in other parts of Europe as well, was a progressive cause. Progressive in what sense?
Progressive in every sense. This was not done by people who thought that they were race haters. This was done by the do-gooders, the liberals, the people who wanted to improve society. Margaret Sanger, a progressive who wanted to help humanity, and her approach to doing that was to wipe away the existence of 2/3 of all people.
The cops came. They didn't find anything. Oh, my God, Tom. I say we just hide it and wait a week. 2 weeks.
Just remember, you brought this on yourselves.
You mean 2/3 of the entire American population?
Yes, of course.
And she actually explicitly said this?
Of course. She wanted to get rid of human weeds. She wrote about this extensively. At one point, Hitler wrote fan mail to one of her colleagues on her board and said, your writings are my Bible.
Now, this is Madison Grant, the head of the New York Zoological Society. Tell me about the meeting between Madison Grant and Whitney, another prominent eugenicist.
Madison Grant is discussing his fan mail from Adolf Hitler, and Whitney has an identical letter just like it. And so they both have letters in which Hitler thanks them. All these eugenicists saying we have had a dramatic impact on Germany.
And you quote an American progressive eugenicist basically saying, hey, whoa, we've got to pick it up. The Nazis are beating us at our own game.
That's right. While we were pussyfooting around, the Nazis were beating us at our own game.
Why is it the case today, if I open a Planned Parenthood brochure, I get a completely different picture of Margaret Sanger than anything that you've described?
What's going on is the reshaping and the falsifying of history. The Nazis also invented history. There's a role for people like me and a role for people like you. We spend our lives trying to authenticate the real history.
We've learned how Hitler got his murderous conquest scheme from the Jacksonian Democrats. We've also learned how he got eugenic schemes from left-wing progressives. But what does Nazi racism owe to the Democratic Party? I went to see the historian and sociologist Stefan Kuehl, who has developed an international reputation for books like The Nazi Connection. I met with him in Munich.
What was the essence of the Nuremberg laws? These are the laws of 1935. What did they seek to do?
They actually gave a first definition of what is a Jew. It was not very easy for the Nazis to define what is a Jew.
Meine Herren, wir sind hier, um Gesetze zu schaffen, die es uns Deutschen ermöglichen, das jüdische Problem zu lösen.
Für solche Gesetze gibt es keine Präzedenzfälle. Weder in Deutschland noch in irgendeiner anderen industrialisierten Nation.
Wie können wir
das Gesetz nutzen, um die Bürger um ihre Rechte zu bringen?
Wir haben einen Präzedenzfall. Das ist unser Plan. Subjekte ohne Bürgerrechte.
Amerika? Die. Ah, Bürger zweiter Klasse.
Warum die Juden absondern? Das Gesetz kann einfach alle Mischen verbieten. Wenn wir spezifische Bezüge auf die Juden vermeiden, hilft es uns, internationale Unterstützung zu bekommen.
Unsinn! Die Amerikaner separieren die Afrikaner ganz eindeutig. So können wir die Juden separieren.
Und wer ist dann ein Jude? Eine Person mit jüdischem Vater, aber deutscher Mutter? Macht das einen Juden aus?
Wie identifizieren die Amerikaner einen Neger?
Die Eintropfenregel. Jede erkennbare Spur schwarzer Abstammung heißt, dass man als Schwarzer gilt.
Menschliche Härte. Auch wenn jemand weiß aussieht und sich wie ein Weißer benimmt, kann er immer noch als Schwarzer gesehen werden.
Die Eintropfenregel ist wohl zu streng. Wir können diese Blutzählung auf 3 jüdische Großeltern beschränken.
The Nazi Nuremberg laws were directly modeled on the segregation laws of the Democratic Party. Every segregation law in the American South was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, and enforced by Democratic officials. As for the Democratic one-drop rule, incredibly, the Nazis found it too racist even for them. As is well known, the Nazis also hated freedom of speech. The Nazi concept was called Gleichschaltung, which means bringing all the cultural institutions in line with Nazi ideology. This was the significance of the Heil Hitler salute and the draping of swastika flags off balconies. These things signaled humble conformity to Nazi doctrine. And what happened to dissident views on the German campus?
Die Elitentheorie schlägt vor, dass eine kleine Minderheit von politischen und ökonomischen Experten die meiste Kraft besitzt. Nicht demokratisch gewählte Führungskräfte.
Jüdische Propaganda!
Raus hier! Das ist mein Klassenzimmer!
Du hast keine Rechte!
Dieses Klassenzimmer gehört wieder. Du kannst nicht mehr frei sagen, was du meinst. Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!
Movements to crush dissent can quickly escalate from episodic violence to mass murder. Hitler's Night of the Broken Glass was justified as a lawful confiscation of firearms. This made Jews defenseless against Nazi assault. Then Hitler could carry out his goal to burn Jewish businesses, destroy synagogues, and eliminate Jews as a competitive threat in the German economy. Hitler didn't just target synagogues, he also targeted Christian churches. Many people don't know this because they've bought the progressive line that Hitler was a Christian. When coming to power, Hitler knew he needed Christian support, and so he feigned public belief in Christianity. But privately, in a series of recordings, Hitler railed against Christianity as a destructive institution contrary to science and the natural law of survival of the fittest. Once in office, Hitler persecuted Christians. His ultimate aim? The total destruction of Christianity in Germany. As a progressive, Hitler despised religious liberty. Nazism was his religion. With Germany the high altar, and Hitler himself the new Messiah. Hitler was no Christian. American progressives cheered Hitler's rise to power. They saw fascism, with its social control and its glorification of the centralized state, as a model for the future. With total control of the people in place, Hitler could now implement his master plan. In 1939, he invaded Poland. Within 2 years, he and Mussolini controlled continental Europe. Japan was at war with China. Fascism was on the march across the world. Soon, Hitler would declare war against America. Once Hitler acquired war captives, he saw a way to implement his own slave plantation, which he called the concentration camp. Concentration camps, which were forced labor camps, should be distinguished from death camps, whose sole purpose was extermination. What was the origin of these death camps?
As Minister of Interior, directed a program aimed at aged, insane, or incurable Germans, the so-called useless eaters. Thousands were committed to special institutions. Few ever returned. Evidence proves they were murdered because they were useless to the plans of the Nazi conspirators.
Let's turn to the Nazi euthanasia laws. First of all, would it be accurate to say that we aren't talking about real euthanasia?
Without consent, neither of the parents nor of the handicapped himself, yeah.
So euthanasia was a pure euphemism, just...
Yes, it was killing. It was a killing program. They started the killing of mentally handicapped before on a very low-scale level, but started systematically with the killing of mentally handicapped after the beginning of the Second World War.
And isn't it true to say that some of the personnel who administered the euthanasia camps were also then later deployed to the so-called death camps that were used on a much larger industrial scale?
That's very clear. We have a technology transfer and a personal transfer from the killing of mentally handicapped to the killing of Jews. And especially the whole stuff operating the gas chambers, for example.
Let me ask you about Joseph Mengele, the notorious Nazi doctor at Auschwitz. When you read about him, he saw himself as as a progressive, somebody advancing not only the cause of science, but the future benefit to humanity.
Progressive idea was very strongly part of the Nazi ideology.
Would it surprise you if I were to tell you that after the war, Mengele went down to South America, where he actually had a sort of career as an abortionist?
No, not at all.
In classic progressive fashion, Mengele made an easy transition from one form of killing to another. Once American and Allied troops liberated the concentration camps, once the world saw these ghostly, emaciated, starving figures emerge from those camps, Nazism, fascism, and theories of racial superiority were permanently discredited. Immediately following the war, in the Nuremberg trials held here in room 600, the full horror of fascist and Nazi atrocities was put before the world.
The United States of America present count 1 of the indictment, that all the defendants participated as organizers or accomplices in a common plan or conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity.
Fascism became the quintessential reference point for human evil.
Hat Ihnen Hitler ausdrücklich verboten, das Memorandum am Polen vom 30. August. Opposition political parties which might defeat or obstruct the policy of the Nazi Party.
Das haben Sie durchaus richtig verstanden.
Hermann Wilhelm Göring, on the counts of the indictment which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging.
American progressives were in a panic. They realized that if future generations of Americans knew the intimate connection between progressivism and the Democratic Party on the one hand and the fascists and Nazis on the other, they would be finished. And so, taking a page from Hitler himself, they settled upon the idea of a big lie. First, they would muddle the meaning of fascism itself. They would take the socialism out of National Socialism. Second, they would move fascism from the left-wing column, where it had always belonged, into the right-wing column. But we must not believe that big lie. The fascists and the Nazis were always on the left. They formed a mutual admiration society with the American left. Even worse, the most destructive and genocidal schemes of the fascists and Nazis were inspired by American progressives and the American Democratic Party. That is the crushing historical truth. Now we go from the left's big lie about fascism to its big lie about racism. Progressive Democrats typically blame racism on America and on the founding, but were the founders to blame for the elaborate system of slave plantations? Historian Alan Gelzo teaches at Gettysburg College and is the author of several award-winning books on the Civil War.
If we speak of the founders as a whole, would it be accurate to say that they believed A, slavery is on a path of extinction, and B, that slavery is a regrettable thing, a bad thing?
They were confident that slavery was going to disappear because it is a contradiction of our fundamental principles.
Are you saying that there really wasn't a formal pro-slavery ideology at the time of the founding?
There's no pro-slavery philosophy that works into the founding.
The founders took specific measures to restrict slavery. They outlawed the slave trade. They prohibited slavery in the vast Northwest territories under the Northwest Ordinance. And they mounted such a strong critique of slavery that by the end of the founding era, slavery went from being a national to a regional institution. Then this happened.
All over the world, the impact of this simple invention was felt almost immediately. Eli Whitney put together a few boards and rollers
and gave the world a giant industry. Cotton was king.
This new expanded plantation system demanded a political party to defend its interests, the Democratic Party.
At the time of the founders, they thought slavery was a dying institution. But in the 19th century, that had changed. They now began to talk about slavery as a progressive institution. And why not? As George Fitzhugh, one of the principal pro-slavery propagandists, argued, isn't slavery the same thing as what we are reading about among European socialists? What else is slavery, Fitzhugh argued, but a practical form of socialism?
Fitzhugh even tried to sell his idea to black leaders. He defends slavery as an early form of the welfare state. Fitzhugh argues that in slavery, unlike in capitalism, the slaves who cannot provide for themselves are looked after from cradle to grave.
If you took the logic of that argument, the idea that the slave plantation is a kind of extended family, that from each according to his abilities to each according to his need, Marxian principle, that this was not only an excuse for enslaving black people, but there was nothing in the logic that prevented you from enslaving a white guy.
Why not enslave white people? Or at least reduce them to an economic status little better than that? Why not also extend slavery into the northern free states? Lincoln thought he discerned the hand of a plot here.
Would it be accurate to say that one of the key differences between the Republican and the Democratic Party is that the one party is founded on the idea of keeping the fruits of your labor, and the other party is founded on the idea we get to take your stuff either for our own use or because we've got some other better use for it?
That became the credo of the Democratic Party.
The cops came. They didn't find anything. Oh my God, Tom. I say we just hide it and wait a week. 2 weeks.
Just remember, you brought this on yourselves.
The great opponent of the Democratic plantation was Abraham Lincoln. In a phrase, Lincoln described the evil of slavery at its core.
You toil and work and earn bread, and I'll eat it. Whenever I hear someone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried out on him personally.
Lincoln ruthlessly exposed Democratic hypocrisy.
Wolves devouring lambs. Not because it is good for their own greedy maws, but because it is good for the lambs.
For Lincoln, the fundamental sin of slavery, curiously enough, was not its racial aspect. That comes after. The fundamental sin of slavery is theft, because it says, you work, you toil, I will take the proceeds of that. And Lincoln's great anxiety was to point out how Northern Democrats had conspired together with Southern Democrats to promote justifications of taking away the fruit of other people's labor.
Guelzo is exposing the progressive strategy of blaming slavery on the South. The Northern Democrats were in league with the Southern Democrats, making slavery the sin not of the South, nor of America, but of the Democratic Party.
Northern Democrats were fully as complicit in this as Southern Democrats.
The powerful New York Democrat Martin Van Buren applied the idea of rural plantations in the South to urban centers in the North. When new immigrants came to America, they were poor, insecure, desperate. Some came as indentured servants. Like the slave populations in the South, they were a vulnerable people. Van Buren created an army of big city bosses, like Boss Tweed, who ran Tammany Hall in New York City, who would raid the treasury and use the money to create a patronage system that would keep immigrant populations collectively dependent on and voting for the Democratic machines, like in this scene from Gangs of New York.
Here to take the chill off your soul on the weight off your heart. Welcome to America, son. Your long, arduous journey is over.
Go back to your own country.
Vote Tammany!
America for...
So before the Civil War, the Democrats' majority status depended upon rural plantations in the South and urban plantations in the North. Lincoln warned that the goal of the Democratic Party was to turn all of America into a plantation. To stop Lincoln, the Democrats went to war. Lincoln won the war and demolished the old Democratic plantation. Republicans took steps to integrate former slaves into American life to create for the first time a multiracial democracy. Republicans pushed through 3 landmark constitutional amendments, freeing the slaves, guaranteeing the right to vote, and securing equal rights under the law. The Democrats overwhelmingly opposed all 3, and these were the Northern Democrats. The Southern Democrats had not yet been let back into the Union. The Democrats needed a new enslavement strategy and someone to implement it. Democratic President Woodrow Wilson knew the national government had defeated the old slave plantation, so he and other progressives wanted a new plantation system ruled by the national government, so it would last forever. Wilson's first step? Federal segregation. He forced his departments to establish separate workstations and restrooms for blacks. Wilson's second step? Racial terrorism. Wilson screened the film Birth of a Nation in the White House. It spurred a national revival of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan had previously been confined to a handful of southern states. Now it stretched from coast to coast. The Klan became the domestic terrorist arm of the Democratic Party. Wilson was the first progressive president. Progressive here means progress toward the powerful centralized state and away from the American founding. In the Democrats' new plantation scheme, the big house is the White House, and the plantation master is the president.